The air was electric, thick with the scent of a false victory and cheap ambition. Everyone, the donors, the strategists, the fervent base, was waiting for Richard. They were waiting for the senator, the presumptive nominee, the next president of the United States to walk out and claim his prize. I stood just off stage, holding my smile tight. A prop, that's what I was. A perfect blonde, 50-year-old prop in a floor-length scarlet dress lay, the symbol of stability and traditional values. For 15 years I had held my husband's hand, kept my mouth shut, and played the part of Clara Thorne, the perfect political wife. Tonight they believed I was waiting for his triumph. In truth, I was waiting for the final, humiliating act of his betrayal. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a countdown timer. I ran a thumbnail over the cold metal corner of the USB drive, hidden deep in the lining of my clutch, my black box, containing the culmination of 4 months of sleepless nights and meticulous investigation. From across the crowded room, I caught the eye of Skye. She was a blur of nervous energy in a shimmering gold cocktail dress, the epitome of a 30-year-old campaign manager, and Richard's fiancée in waiting. She was already preening, adjusting the diamond bracelet Richard had given her last week, a piece I'd seen on his expense report under office supplies and vendor gifts. She thought tonight was her debut. Richard's mother, Eleanor Thorne, a woman with a face carved from granite and a history of silent cruelty, materialized at my elbow. "Such a good wife, Clara," she murmured, patting my arm with a hand that felt brittle and cold. "Staying by his side? Even now? It takes a real woman to put aside her own feelings for the good of the ticket." She didn't know I knew. None of them did. They all thought I was simple, a society lady whose only concern was managing the seating charts for the next charity ball. They never saw the reporter I was before Richard. They never saw the woman I meticulously documented the rot in their family's foundation. Richard's chief of staff, a perpetually stressed man named Marcus, leaned into me. "5 minutes, Clara. You look perfect. Just a tiny bit more emotion when he brings you out. Sympathy sells." Sympathy sells. That was the core of Richard's election night script, the final genius piece of political theatre. I knew the planned sequence by heart. The victory lap. Richard would stride out, soaking up the applause for 20 minutes. The divorce drama. He would then turn to me, his voice thick with fake earnestness, and deliver his shock. He'd frame the divorce as a noble, mutual sacrifice. Clara deserves better than this weary politician's life, thereby preempting any negative press and garnering a wave of public sympathy for the burdened man of duty. The new dawn. Skye would walk out, he'd announce their engagement, and the narrative would pivot. Richard is a man who chooses renewal and the future. He genuinely believed my public tears would win him the White House. He was about to find out my tears were reserved for the life I wasted, not the man I was leaving. I felt a sudden tap on my shoulder. It was Ben Harper, the grizzled, unflappable editor of the Capitol Ledger. He was dressed in a standard, ill-fitting dark suit, a man entirely out of place in this glittering, corrupt carnival. "Clara," he said, his eyes conveying a mix of anxiety and rock-solid commitment. "We're synchronized. We hit publish the second you give the word." I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Stay near the center aisle, Ben, and make sure the feed is clean." He slipped back into the crowd. Ben was the one ally Richard never accounted for. My family built the Ledger. Richard forced me to sideline it when we married, calling it an embarrassment to his polished image. But I had installed Ben, a man who valued truth over politics, and for 4 months I had been feeding him the black box data. Richard's greatest skill was making people believe his lies. His greatest weakness was his arrogance. He thought I was too stupid to see the shell companies and the offshore accounts. The investigation had started small. A $50,000 payment labelled catering services that went to a Cayman Islands firm, then a $120,000 consulting fee to a firm owned by Skye's brother. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Richard Thorne wasn't just a political adulterer, he was a massive financial fraudster. He had diverted over $8.3 million in campaign donations, money meant for grassroots organising, for veterans' health programmes he championed for his constituents, into his personal untraceable accounts. His entire campaign was a massive criminal money laundering scheme. The final piece of the puzzle, The key that unlocked the rest was a printout of an email I'd found in a discarded campaign binder. It was from a shadowy financial lawyer asking Richard to confirm the code for Operation Offshore. The code was Scarlet Prop, a cruel private joke he had used to refer to me during his secretive calls with Sky. It was the same joke that had inspired the colour of my dress tonight. He was waiting for me to be tearful and compliant. Instead, I was armed with a USB drive, a highly vetted exposé, and a plan for a public execution of his career. The lights dimmed again. The announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, your next President of the United States, Senator Richard Thorne." The crowd surged forward, shouting his name. Richard strode onto the stage, beaming, a titan, a star. For 20 minutes he delivered his speech, hitting every mark, the soaring rhetoric, the self-effacing humour, the promise of a better tomorrow. His words were empty to me, a soundtrack to the chaos I was about to unleash. Finally, he reached his final paragraph, the one that meant the most to him. He paused, his face softening into that practiced, manipulative, earnest look. "And now," he said, his voice quiet, "I need to talk about sacrifice. The greatest sacrifice a man can make is forcing the love of his life to endure a life she no longer deserves." He turned, the hand that held the notes now gesturing toward me. The divorce papers were discreetly visible in his left hand. Sky, the mistress, started her slow walk from the sidelines. "Clara," Richard continued, his voice thick with that fake emotion, "you have been an unparalleled wife, but you deserve better than this weary politician. We have made a mutual decision to end this marriage so we can both find peace and I can focus on serving this nation." He took a breath, ready to announce his new engagement, and watch me shatter. But I didn't shatter. I stepped forward. I walked up to the stage, my scarlet dress a blur of motion, took the microphone right out of his startled hand and faced the sea of cameras. The room went silent, utterly stunned. Richard's face contorted into a mask of utter confusion. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice ringing clearly, "for your honesty and for reminding me that I deserve to find my voice again." I didn't hand the microphone to a network reporter. I handed it to Ben Harper, who stepped onto the stage, a man entirely without the requisite security pass, holding a massive phone broadcasting a live stream. Ben didn't hesitate. He took the microphone and looked directly into the lead network camera. "Good evening, America. My name is Ben Harper. I am the editor-in-chief of the Capitol Ledger, and while Senator Thorne was celebrating his victory tonight, the Ledger was preparing the real story." I gave a final, coded signal. Suddenly, the massive Thorne for President screen behind us, which moments ago had been flashing the celebratory election results, went black. It immediately flashed a new headline in stark, aggressive white font. "Breaking. Operation Offshore. Senator Thorne stole $8.3 million in campaign funds." The ballroom erupted. Screams, gasps. Richard looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He lunged for Ben, but a burly man I recognized as a former police contact of Ben's, now serving as my security detail, stepped smoothly in Richard's path. Sky, the mistress, stopped dead in her tracks, halfway up the stairs to the stage, her gold dress suddenly looking tawdry. Her face was paper white. She wasn't getting a diamond ring. She was getting a front row seat to a federal investigation. Ben's voice was loud, authoritative, cutting through the escalating chaos. "For months, we have investigated irrefutable evidence provided by a meticulous source, evidence of campaign finance fraud, a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and a complex web of money laundering using campaign funds." He paused, then looked directly at the camera, his final statement a formal charge before the American people. The source was not anonymous to us. The source was the one person Richard Thorne thought was too docile, too quiet, and too foolish to notice. The source was Clara Thorne. The crowd was a sea of turning heads, pointing fingers, and frantic phone calls. Richard's face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an exit, a lawyer, a lie. I walked back to the center of the stage, took the microphone from Ben one last time, and faced the cameras. I spoke directly to the American people, my voice even and calm. "I apologize to my supporters for the shame this brings, but let the record show I did not choose this man's corruption, but I am choosing how his career ends. I will be cooperating fully with the US Attorney's Office." As I spoke, the final crucial element of the plan unfolded. Two men in dark suits, actual US Marshals, not security, came up the steps. They had the warrant ready. They knew exactly where to go. Richard, I finally found his voice. "This is insane! Marcus, call the lawyers! Call the president! This is a setup!" The Marshals didn't pause. They reached Richard Thorne, who was sputtering and grabbing at his tie. They showed him the warrant, and then with a sharp clink, they put handcuffs on Senator Richard Thorne right there, live, in front of the world. He was being arrested for campaign finance fraud and money laundering. I watched him get led away. I watched his mother, Eleanor, sink into a chair, her granite face finally cracking, weeping not for me, but for the loss of her power. I watched Skye, the mistress, turn and flee the ballroom, realizing she wasn't getting a luxury condo. She was getting a subpoena. I looked at the cameras one last time and walked off the stage. Then I turned and walked off the stage. Richard thought I was his prop. He thought a perfect public scandal built on my shame would lift him to the highest office. He was right about one thing. The scandal was perfect. It just wasn't his victory. It was mine. The silence in the presidential suite was the most deafening sound of the night. 10 minutes ago, I was on stage with a man who thought I was his chattel. Now he was in a booking facility, and I was on the phone with Aisha, my divorce attorney, making sure the legal system didn't give him a chance to breathe. "Aisha, you saw the live feed," I said, my voice low and urgent. "The narrative is set. We need to file the divorce papers now. Use the abuse of marital funds clause, not just adultery. The $8.3 million in the Capital Ledger report is key." Richard's entire plan hinged on him filing first, painting me as the tragic, sad wife he kindly set free. I was going to ensure he was the indicted criminal served divorce papers in a federal holding cell. Aisha, bless her, was already on it. "I'm filing within the hour, Clara. We're using the articles as Exhibit A, but Richard's legal team will be scrambling. We need to secure your assets immediately. The marital home, the trust accounts. What about the Thorne Political Foundation?" The foundation, Richard's supposed passion project, a non-profit intended to fund leadership seminars. In reality, it was another shell company. The foundation is worthless, Aisha, but it's a liability. The main asset he cares about is the Georgetown townhouse. It's in both our names, but I know how the money was sourced. This was the part of the story they all missed. Richard and his mother always treated me like a woman who brought nothing to the table. They forgot that when we married, my family was already wealthy. The townhouse wasn't bought with Richard's campaign funds. It was a wedding gift from my father. Richard was an egoist, but he was also a scared narcissist who needed control. 15 years ago, my father insisted the deed for the Georgetown property be drafted in my name first, with Richard added 2 months later. It was a small, quiet act of protection that I, blinded by love, thought unnecessary at the time. "Aisha," I said, pulling the tiny USB drive, the black box, from my clutch. "The original deed is here in digital format. It shows the transfer from my father's trust before Richard's name was added to the title. It's an excluded asset, not marital property." A satisfied sigh came across the line from Aisha. "That changes everything, Clara. No asset division, no sale. He can't claim his half. He can claim half the furniture, maybe the ugly taxidermy moose head in the study, but the $4 million house is yours." But there was one more thing they hadn't counted on. Something I had kept secret even from my lawyer until this moment. "Aisha, I need to open a separate offshore-proof account. Immediately. My Aunt Margaret passed away 6 months ago. She was a recluse in Geneva. Her will went through probate quietly. I inherited her estate, a trust containing $15 million in diversified securities." The silence this time was Aisha's genuine surprise. "Clara, Richard knows nothing about this?" "Nothing. Aunt Margaret loathed him. She stipulated the trust was to remain secret until my absolute and full independence was established. I think the moment he was arrested on live television counts." I was not just a woman seeking a fair divorce settlement. I was an independently wealthy woman who was about to use my own money to bury my criminal ex-husband. Richard's mother, Eleanor, was his only true confidant. She wasn't weeping for her son. She was weeping for the loss of the presidency and the power that came with it. I knew she would be the first to call the shots from outside the jail. My personal cell phone, the one Richard thought he monitored, rang. It was Eleanor. I answered immediately. "Clara, where are you? You little traitor!" Her voice was raw, venomous. "You ruined him. You ruined the family name." "Good evening, Eleanor," I replied, my voice calm, the noise of the now empty suite around me a dramatic contrast to her hysterical fury. "I'm safe, and no, I didn't ruin him. Richard ruined himself. I merely presented the evidence." "Evidence? You forged those documents. You manipulated that little newspaper of your father's. Do you think anyone will believe you? You're a discarded wife who is angry and jealous. We will sue you into bankruptcy. You pauper." I sighed, a long, genuine sigh of weariness. "Eleanor, I understand your concern for Richard's future, or lack thereof, but you should know that I filed for divorce 30 minutes ago, citing the $8.3 million in campaign fraud as grounds for abuse of marital assets. The judge will see that Richard was funneling money into accounts meant for his mistress." I paused, letting the word mistress hang in the air like a rotting fish. "As for your threat of bankruptcy," I continued smoothly, "perhaps you should check the land records for the townhouse. It was a premarital gift from my father. Richard can claim the old newspapers in the garage, but the house is mine. And the other thing you should know, Eleanor, is that my attorney has already been in contact with the US Attorney's Office regarding your own extensive involvement in the Thorn Political Foundation's leadership seminars. I have the expense reports for your $50,000 trips to Tuscany under charity planning." Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence from the other end. Richard's humiliation was public. His mother's was private. But devastating. But I still needed to deal with Skye, the woman who had happily tried to steal my life and my fortune. I knew Skye had fled the ballroom, likely hiding in a cheaper hotel, panicking about her association with a federal criminal. I sent her a single text message from a burner phone Ben provided, to Skye. Subject, the townhouse. "Skye, I found your note in Richard's coat. The one that said, 'I can't wait to host parties in our new Georgetown condo.' You won't be. Richard doesn't own it. I do. Enjoy the fallout. P.S. The diamond bracelet? Federal Exhibit B. It was paid for with campaign money." I watched the text bubble change to read. I knew that message wouldn't just crush her dreams. It would turn her into another key witness against Richard. A scorned mistress is a dangerous weapon. My vengeance wasn't about spite. It was about justice and self-preservation. By ensuring his mother was panicked and his mistress was furious and terrified, I was making sure Richard had no safe harbour, no loyal lieutenant left to run interference. The next morning, the silence was even more profound. The front page of every paper was a screaming headline about the election night scandal. Richard Thorn's face, mid-arrest, was a permanent historical image. I sat in my study, a room Richard had deemed too feminine for his political work, surrounded by boxes being packed. The packing wasn't for me to move out, but for Richard's belongings to be transferred to a storage unit, paid for with his half of the remaining joint savings. Aisha smiled as she sealed the final document. "The divorce filing is secured, Clara. The townhouse is officially untouchable. The US attorney is ecstatic about the campaign finance documentation. You are free." I looked out the window at the familiar Georgetown street, now lined with news vans. It wasn't just the money or the house I'd saved. I had saved my future. "Aisha, my parents were right when they named that small news outlet the Capital Ledger," I mused. "It means a book or register for keeping accounts." Richard thought he was a master politician, but he was just an amateur criminal who didn't realize his own wife was keeping the final ledger. I signed the last check, a massive retainer for Aisha's firm, paid from my Aunt Margaret's previously untouchable Swiss account. Richard would never know that he wasn't just battling a wife. He was battling a multimillionaire determined to see justice served. "I'm going to take a long trip, Aisha," I said, standing up. "My focus now is on rehabilitating the Capital Ledger. I have a legacy to reclaim, a publication to fund, and a new life to build. Richard Thorn is a footnote now. My story is just beginning." I looked at the boxes with his name on them, the awards, the framed photos with powerful figures, the endless ties and cufflinks. It was the material legacy of a life built on a lie, now reduced to storage unit fodder. Richard was out on bail within 36 hours. His mother, Eleanor, had posted a bond mortgaging a substantial portion of her personal property, a detail that brought me a small cold satisfaction. His chief political counsel had fled, so he hired a new, aggressive, but distinctly second-tier legal team focused on one thing: damage control. Their strategy was predictable: attack the source. Richard immediately scheduled a press conference outside the courthouse. His goal was not to defend himself against the fraud charges, but to discredit me. He planned to paint me as a vengeful, emotionally disturbed wife who fabricated evidence because she was being replaced by a younger woman. I watched the live stream of the chaotic scene on my laptop, sipping coffee in the townhouse study. My lawyer, Aisha, sat beside me, preparing our public counterstrike. Richard stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly, but forcing that familiar, earnest politician's frown. "This entire situation is a vicious, unhinged attack on a man who chose duty over personal happiness," he began, his voice raspy. "My former wife, Clara, is a woman suffering from severe emotional instability. She was unable to cope with the reality of our mutual separation, and out of spite, she orchestrated this theatrical, fabricated ambush using her family's failing newspaper to publish lies." He even cried, a perfect politician's tear, timed for the afternoon news cycle. "I love Clara," he choked out, "and I wish her nothing but peace. But she needs help, and I intend to clear my name and return to serving the American people, despite this sickening betrayal by a woman who has lost her way." Richard's press conference was a desperate appeal to misogyny and old-school pity. If he had only been charged with adultery, it might have worked. But he was charged with felony fraud. My countermove had to be precise, unemotional, and irrefutable. Aisha smiled grimly. "He just played right into our hands, Clara. He tried to make this about emotion. We will make this about numbers." Our press conference was scheduled 1 hour later, not outside a courthouse, but inside the elegant oak-panelled headquarters of the Capitol Ledger. This choice immediately signaled that the focus was on journalism, not personal drama. I wore a simple, professional navy suit, the antithesis of the scarlet dress. I walked to the podium and didn't mention Richard, Skye, or divorce. I spoke only about facts. "Senator Thorne has suggested that the evidence of financial crimes published by the Capitol Ledger is fabricated and motivated by personal malice," I began, my voice perfectly steady, reading from notes on the screen that mirrored Ben's reporting. "Therefore, I want to release to the public the unredacted financial records that the Ledger verified. These documents, which I provided to the U.S. Attorney, include wire transfer confirmations showing Senator Thorne moving $500,000 from the campaign's Veterans Outreach Fund to a numbered account in the Cayman Islands." I paused, and Ben pushed a button. The large screen behind me displayed a single damning image: a bank statement with the transfer amount and the routing information. Furthermore, attached to one of those transfers is a coded note. The note states, "For Operation Offshore, Scarlet prop code confirmed." The room, packed with national media, went utterly silent. I looked straight into the camera. "Senator Thorne's personal nicknames for me are irrelevant," I stated coldly. "What is relevant is that he used a code based on his secret life to facilitate a federal crime. The evidence is not based on my feelings. It is based on bank transfers, account numbers, and his own handwriting." Richard had tried to control the narrative by appealing to emotion. I destroyed the narrative with irrefutable data. The shift in the media was instantaneous. Richard was no longer a sympathetic, betrayed husband. He was a calculating criminal who had mocked his wife while stealing from his voters. I had one more piece of legal strategy to unveil. "Finally," I concluded, "Senator Thorne's lawyers have filed a motion to freeze our marital assets and the townhouse, citing the divorce proceedings. The house," Senator Thorne claimed, "was a joint asset purchased during the marriage. Today, my lawyer, Aisha, filed the original deed for the Georgetown property, proving it was a premarital gift from my father's trust, and is therefore legally excluded from the marital estate." I held up a copy of the deed. "I am not interested in dividing a life built on crime. I am only interested in reclaiming the life that was stolen from me and ensuring justice is served for the millions of voters he defrauded. I will not be granting him alimony, nor will I be allowing him to remain in my home." The finality in my voice was absolute. Richard's team had walked into the courthouse with a plan for a protracted, messy fight. They walked out knowing the fight was already over. My phone rang as soon as I stepped off the podium. It was Eleanor. This time there was no venom, only fear. "Clara, please, we have to talk about the foundation," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "They're calling me. The federal investigators. That Tuscany trip. It was just for fundraising analysis." "Fundraising analysis in a villa with a pool, Eleanor?" I asked, completely devoid of sympathy. "I have the receipts. You used foundation money, a non-profit intended to help disadvantaged students, to pay for your luxury vacations. That's embezzlement." "But Richard told me." "Richard lied to everyone, Eleanor, including you. Now you have a choice. You can cooperate with the US attorney, return the funds you misappropriated and testify that Rich was the mastermind of the foundation's fraud, or you can join him in the dock." I knew she was a survivor. She valued her freedom and her remaining fortune above her son's. She was the best witness I could secure against Richard. "Think about your legacy." "Eleanor," I said softly, delivering the final calculated blow. "The throne name is finished, but you can be the woman who helped clean up the mess." I hung up before she could reply. Richard's last lifeline, his ferocious, loyal mother, was now fighting for herself. The political and legal machinery that had protected him for decades was now turning on him. My final piece of leverage came in an email an hour later. It was from Sky's attorney. Subject: Sky Thorne,
former camp manager.
"Dear Miss Thorne, my client, Miss Sky, is prepared to offer a full and truthful account of Senator Thorne's operation offshore and his misuse of campaign funds, including the provenance of several gifts, such as the diamond bracelet. She wishes to cooperate fully and provide testimony under an agreement of immunity." The text message I sent Sky, reminding her the house was mine and her bracelet was evidence, had worked. She wasn't loyal, she was transactional. When the transaction went bad, she folded. Richard was now completely exposed. His wife, his mother, and his mistress, the three women who defined his public and private life, were all positioned to testify against him. I looked at the chaos unfolding on the news channels, the pundits, the talking heads, the flashing headlines. No one was talking about the divorce, or my emotions, or a sympathy vote. They were talking about the $8.3 million. My vengeance was complete, not with a tear or a shout, but with a strategic surgical strike that turned his strongest assets against him. The townhouse felt different now. No longer a gilded cage, it was a fortress. I looked at the packed boxes with Richard's name. They were ready for the storage unit. His chapter in my life was closed. My focus was now on the future. Public relations battle was won, but the legal war had just begun. The US Attorney's Office was moving with surgical speed, galvanized by the irrefutable evidence from my black box and the overwhelming media pressure. 2 weeks after the election night debacle, Senator Richard Thorne's world collapsed again. The Senate Ethics Committee, desperate to distance itself from the stench of scandal, voted unanimously to initiate expulsion proceedings. Facing inevitable public humiliation, Richard did the only thing he had left to protect his pension and his fragile ego. He resigned. "He gave up his seat, Clara," Aisha said through the video screen, a satisfied smile on her face. "The US attorney is ecstatic. That's an admission of guilt, politically speaking. They're moving for a grand jury indictment next week." "And the divorce?" I asked, looking around the empty study. The rug, the curtains, even Richard's hideous desk, all gone. "The divorce is a formality," Aisha confirmed. "He tried to claim the townhouse furniture, arguing communal enjoyment, but when we presented the deed proving the house is yours, he caved. We negotiated a quick settlement. He takes his $15,000 car, half the value of the cabin, and all his debt. No alimony. You are a free woman, legally speaking, as of next week." I nodded, feeling a quiet victory that was deeper than euphoria. "Good. Now, what about Eleanor? Did she flip?" Ben, the editor of the Capitol Ledger, chimed in. She's cooperating, reluctantly. She returned the misappropriated $200,000 to the foundation's accounts and is prepared to testify that Richard directed all the fraudulent financial moves. She saved her own skin, but she just drove the nail into his coffin." Richard Thorne now stood alone, unemployed, indicted and betrayed by his mother, his mistress, and his wife. The life he had so ruthlessly built was nothing but dust. The Georgetown townhouse had been my cage for 15 years, but now it was my fortress. Yet, I couldn't stay. Every polished floorboard, every intricate crown moulding echoed with the sound of Richard's hollow promises. I had arranged for a specialized team to handle the final steps, retrieving my personal items and shipping Richard's possessions, the framed photos, the expensive but utterly tasteless awards, to a storage unit. I walked into his old war room, the study where he'd plotted his career and his betrayal. On the wall, I saw a pale square where his portrait with the former president used to hang. I ran my hand over the wall. I realized my final act of leaving needed to be physical. It was time to close the door on the Clara Thorne political wife character for good. I arranged to stay at a small, discreet hotel for a few weeks while I secured a new apartment. The separation from the townhouse, from the familiar luxury, felt like a necessary shedding of skin. I had $15 million in my Geneva account and full ownership of the house, but the most valuable thing I possessed was the freedom to walk away from it all. Before I left, I sat in the empty living room, looking at the large windows that framed the street where I had so often waited for him to return. I am not bitter, I thought. I am reborn. Richard believed I was emotionally fragile. He never accounted for the fact that I had been gathering strength and proof while he was busy lying. My new mission was clear: reclaim my legacy. The Capital Ledger had been my family's passion, a small, fearless publication that prioritized truth over access. Richard had forced me to neglect it, to starve it of funds and attention. Now it was my focus, my new purpose. I used my own money, not Richard's tainted funds, to establish a new, robust endowment for the Ledger. I was no longer the political wife. I was the publisher and primary benefactor. I sat down with Ben Harper to discuss the future. He looked exhausted but exhilarated. Clara, the website traffic is through the roof. Subscriptions are soaring. We broke a major corruption story and brought down a presidential nominee. The Ledger is finally a national name. And that's exactly what worries me, Ben, I replied, running my finger over a headline about Richard's resignation. We can't become the Thorne scandal rag. Our integrity is paramount. We exposed him because he was a criminal, not because he was my husband. So what's next? He asked. Do we keep digging into the foundation? There are plenty of crooked politicians out there. We pivot, I stated firmly. We take the $8.3 million Richard stole and show the public exactly where it should have gone. We launch a massive investigative series on the Veterans Outreach Fund he gutted. We turn his crime into a force for good. That is how we prove our integrity. The energy in the room was palpable. We were moving past revenge and into reclamation. Richard's humiliation deepened when he tried to access his former senatorial office. He arrived with a small box, ready to clear out his personal effects, only to be met by a stern young aide who informed him his access had been revoked. I learned this detail from an anonymous source on Capitol Hill, a former staffer of Richard's whom I had always treated kindly. Richard was forced to wait on the curb while a junior aide delivered his box of personal belongings. Inside the box was a slightly damaged, framed picture of us from our wedding day, a painful symbol of the perfect life he had thrown away. The humiliation was complete, a former senator, now an indicted federal criminal, waiting on the curb for a cardboard box. Sky, meanwhile, had fully turned against him. She was already in Florida, giving interviews to reporters, painting Richard as a controlling monster. She was saving her own skin, but her testimony destroyed Richard's last chance at claiming moral authority. He was not only a thief, but a sadistic manipulator, according to his own mistress. His mother, Eleanor, had sold her prized summer cottage to cover the legal bills and had moved into a small, nondescript apartment. Her phone calls to Richard were now about money and logistics, not power. Richard Thorne was alone. I, on the other hand, was packing my bags for a temporary move to Geneva, where my Aunt Margaret's lawyers needed me to finalize the trust and oversee the transfer of funds. I was leaving the country not as an exile, but as a woman stepping into her inheritance. I closed the townhouse door for the final time. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. I simply got into the black SUV I had hired, ready for the airport. As the car pulled away, I felt the phantom weight of the scarlet dress lift from my shoulders. The heavy costume of the political wife was gone. I opened my laptop. The Capital Ledger homepage displayed the new headline, not about Richard, but about the investigation into the veterans' funds he had stolen. The focus was already shifting, and my life was shifting with it. I'd been told I was too old, too quiet, too emotional to fight a man like Richard Thorne. But they underestimated the power of the underestimated wife. We see everything, we manage everything, and when pushed, we are the ones who hold the final ledger. Richard thought he was walking away with a young wife and millions of dollars. He was left with an indictment, a mountain of debt, and the realization that his downfall was funded, orchestrated, and flawlessly executed by the woman he had dismissed as the scarlet prop. A year had passed since the night the cameras stopped rolling. The blur of legal motions, depositions, and grand jury hearings had culminated in this: the United States of America versus Richard Thorne. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Richard had traded the grand stage of the Senate for the cramped courtroom, his expensive tailoring replaced by a look of permanent cheap anxiety. I was there every day. Not out of spite, but out of a need for closure. I wasn't just the former wife. I was a key prosecution witness, the source who had cracked the case. I was now primarily based in Geneva, overseeing my Aunt Margaret's foundation and actively funding the Capital Ledger's new investigative series on campaign finance reform. My life was defined by purpose, not by a political career. Richard's life was defined by the indictment. The prosecution's first star witness was Richard's mother, Eleanor Thorne. She entered the courtroom looking old, shrunken, and utterly defeated. She had taken the deal: testify against her son regarding the foundation fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. The silence in the courtroom was thick when she sat down. Richard's face, a mask of cold fury, told the whole story of their shattered loyalty. Eleanor spoke in a monotone, answering the prosecutor's questions with grudging precision. She detailed how Richard had instructed her to funnel contributions from the Thorne Political Foundation into shell accounts disguised as consulting fees, which she then used for personal expenses. "Mrs. Thorne," the prosecutor asked, "when you signed off on these transfers, did you believe they were legitimate charitable expenses?" "No," Eleanor mumbled, not looking at her son. "Richard told me it was necessary political bookkeeping. He assured me it was fully legal, but only if I kept it secret from Clara." The key phrase "from Clara" was a devastating blow. It proved intent, deceit, and the isolation of the one person who might have stopped the crime. Eleanor had sacrificed her son to save her own legacy. The finality of their separation felt colder than any divorce. Next, the prosecution called Skye. The former campaign manager and mistress entered the court in an expensive, sleek white suit, attempting to maintain an air of sophistication. She, too, had taken a deal: full immunity in exchange for her testimony regarding Operation Offshore gifts Richard had bought her with stolen money. "Miss Thorne," the prosecutor began. She had married quickly after the scandal, dropping Richard's name entirely. "Can you describe the conversation you had with the defendant regarding the $8.3 million in campaign funds?" Skye, without hesitation, launched into a detailed, venomous account of Richard's arrogance. "He called it his retirement fund," Skye said, her voice dripping with scorn. "He said the voters were sheep and that Clara was a fool who would never check the numbers. He was ecstatic when he found the code, Scarlet Prop, and used it to access the funds." She pointed to the diamond bracelet now introduced as evidence. "He told me he bought this for me using a wire transfer from the Veterans Outreach Fund. He said it was an excellent irony." Richard's defense attorney tried to discredit her, painting her as a bitter, opportunistic young woman. "Miss Thorne, isn't it true you are only testifying because you lost a lucrative potential marriage and are seeking publicity?" Skye turned, looking the defense attorney dead in the eye. "I am testifying, sir, because Richard Thorne is a pathological liar and a criminal. He stole from veterans and he lied to me about his ability to fund our life. I may be opportunistic, but he is a felon." The exchange, broadcast live on news feeds, confirmed what everyone suspected. Richard was a man who exploited anyone who trusted him. My turn was last. I took the stand not as the aggrieved wife, but as the source. "Miss Sterling," the prosecutor. I had legally returned to my maiden name. Began, "Can you tell the jury what motivated you to investigate your then husband's financial records?" I looked at the jury, 12 ordinary Americans who held Richard's fate in their hands. "I investigated because I was the one who managed the books," I stated calmly. "I handled the spreadsheets, the invoices, and the accounts. When I saw a pattern of large transfers to shell companies, I did what any responsible person or any good journalist would do. I followed the money." I detailed the discovery of the Scarlet Prop Code, the quiet meetings with Ben Harper, and the moment I realized the depth of the betrayal, I presented the bank statements, the emails, and the premarital deed for the townhouse as unemotional fact. Richard's defense attorney tried to corner me, returning to his initial attack strategy. "Miss Sterling, isn't it true that you orchestrated this entire spectacle, the election night arrest, the public testimony, purely out of vengeance and heartbreak over your husband leaving you for a younger woman?" I looked at him calmly. "Counselor, Richard Thorne filed for divorce citing adultery. I filed for divorce citing federal felony fraud. Heartbreak is a human emotion. Felony fraud is a crime. Richard's actions cost him his Senate seat and his freedom. My actions secured my family's newspaper, the Capital Ledger, and recovered my financial independence. Justice is not vengeance, Counselor. It is accountability." The courtroom murmurs and the sharp nod from the judge told me the question had backfired spectacularly. The jury was out for only 4 hours. A surprisingly short deliberation for a case of this magnitude, suggesting the evidence, my black box, was devastatingly conclusive. I sat in the courtroom, Aisha's hand on my arm. The bailiff called the court to order. Richard stood, his shoulders slumped, his face defeated. The jury foreman stood. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Richard Thorne, guilty." "On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant, Richard Thorne, guilty." "On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant, Richard Thorne, guilty." The sound was not a shout of victory, but a gavel strike, the final absolute sound of my freedom. Richard Thorne collapsed back into his seat, a broken man. 3 months later, the sentencing hearing was short and brutal. The judge, citing the betrayal of public trust and the stealing of funds intended for veterans, gave Richard Thorne an unforgiving sentence. The judge showed no mercy. Richard received 12 years in federal prison. He was ordered to pay full restitution of the $8.3 million, a debt he would carry for the rest of his life. I watched Richard as the marshals led him away. I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no triumph. Just emptiness, swiftly followed by a sense of profound relief. The chapter was closed, the book was finished, and the main character was justly imprisoned. I left the courthouse, not running from the cameras this time, but walking past them, my head held high. A swarm of reporters surrounded me, shouting questions. I paused, looked at the reporters from the Associated Press, and made a final statement. My family and I are satisfied that justice has been served. My only focus now is on continuing the work of the Capital Ledger, ensuring that every public official is held accountable and that the millions of dollars Richard Thorne stole are returned to the programs he defrauded. The truth always wins. I got into the car with Aisha and left. I was no longer the Scarlet Prop. I was Clara Sterling, publisher, philanthropist, and free woman. The final gavel strike freed me, but it was my purpose that saved me. I spent the year after the trial moving between my Aunt Margaret's trust offices in Geneva and the newly renovated Capital Ledger headquarters in DC. I wasn't the grieving ex-wife. I was the publisher. I had finally reclaimed my identity. Clara Sterling, the investigative journalist Richard had tried to bury. The Capital Ledger, now richly endowed by my inheritance, was thriving. It wasn't about selling gossip. It was about ethical, aggressive journalism. We launched the Thorne Fund Recovery Project, a massive series of reports dedicated to tracking the $8.3 million Richard stole and holding the government accountable for returning it to the proper programs. Clara, the Veterans Outreach Fund, received their first transfer last week, Ben reported, his face glowing on the screen. We secured $1.5 million thanks to the pressure from our reporting. We're doing more good than Richard ever pretended to. Excellent, Ben, I replied, a genuine smile reaching my eyes. Now I want you to shift focus. We proved that campaign finance fraud is systemic. Let's launch the Integrity Initiative, a permanent investigative unit dedicated to monitoring the opaque funding of all PACs and foundations. Use Aunt Margaret's funds to hire 5 more investigative reporters. The $15 million inheritance wasn't just my security, it was my philanthropic weapon. I was using the fortune Richard never knew about to fund the kind of truth-telling that would prevent another Richard Thorne from ever rising to power. Life in Geneva was a sanctuary of quiet luxury and intense work. I had the space to breathe, to heal, and to build without the constant, suffocating weight of Richard's ambition. I reconnected with my passions. I started writing again, not political commentary, but thoughtful essays on the role of accountability in public life. I enrolled in advanced literature classes at the local university, a simple joy Richard had always dismissed as a waste of networking time. I met new friends, people who valued my mind, not my connections. There was Mark, a distinguished professor of European history who knew nothing of the Thorne scandal until he looked me up months later. He was drawn to my quiet intensity, my love of books, and the deep, steady resolve in my eyes. Dating was terrifying at first. I was wary of charm, allergic to ambition, and deeply suspicious of any man who talked about money or power. But Mark was different. He saw my trauma and respected my boundaries. When he finally asked about my past, I told him the whole story, calmly and honestly. He listened intently, then said, "Clara, you didn't seek revenge. You performed justice. You simply used your intelligence to protect yourself and to serve the truth. That is a rare and courageous thing." His validation felt more valuable than any divorce settlement. I was not defined by my broken marriage. I was defined by the strength I found in escaping it. Richard's life, meanwhile, was the subject of occasional grim updates from Aisha. His appeal had been denied. He was serving his time in a low-security federal prison, a man of soaring ambition reduced to routine and regret. His mother, Eleanor, had completely cut him off. Her one remaining goal was to salvage her own reputation. She was desperately trying to re-enter DC society, but the stain of the Foundation's scandal was permanent. Richard had ruined his mother's pride and her standing in the one world she valued. Skye had lost her veneer of wealth. Her quick marriage to the entrepreneur had ended in a messy public separation. It turned out she was attracted to power, not people, and without Richard's political glow, she had nothing to offer. She was now a cautionary tale on a few fringe blogs. The final piece of the marital estate was the cabin in rural Virginia. Richard, in his rage, insisted it be sold to split the meager proceeds. I agreed. I used my portion of the sale to buy the plot of land next to the cabin and donated the entire combined acreage to the National Park Service, ensuring the land Richard had wanted to sell for profit would remain a pristine nature preserve forever. It was a small, silent victory. Richard would never set foot on that land again, and neither would I. I severed the last physical tie to our shared life. 3 years after the trial, I returned to DC for a Capital Ledger Awards dinner. I was presenting a new award for ethical journalism. I stayed in a hotel downtown, consciously avoiding the Georgetown townhouse, which I had quietly sold a year ago. It wasn't about the money, it was about cutting the anchor. At the dinner, I watched Ben and his team receive a standing ovation for their Integrity Initiative work. My family's legacy was not only intact, but shining brighter than ever. During my acceptance speech for the Publisher of the Year award, I reflected on the journey. 4 years ago, I said, looking out at the room full of journalists, policymakers, and ethical leaders, I was a woman defined by my role next to a powerful man. I was told I was too quiet, too soft, too emotional to understand the real game of power. But I want to tell you, the quiet ones are the ones who are truly watching. We are the ones who notice the discrepancies on the spreadsheet, the shifts in the ledger, and the coldness in the eyes of a liar. We are not emotional, we are meticulous. The courage it takes to confront a narcissist is immense, but the courage to then build a new life based on truth is even greater. I raised my glass. To the quiet observers, the meticulous note-takers, and the ones who choose light over power. Sometimes, I think back to that election night, the scarlet dress, the cheering crowds, the look on Richard's face as the handcuffs closed. It feels like a story I read, not one I lived. Richard thought our marriage was a transaction that ended when he found a younger model. He thought my purpose was to cry on stage. He failed to understand that the scarlet prop was just a disguise. Underneath the perfect political wife was Clara Sterling, the investigative journalist who had been taking notes for 15 years. I lost a husband, a life of prestige, and 15 years of my prime. But in return, I gained $15 million in financial freedom, reclaimed my family's legacy, and secured my dignity. Richard is serving his sentence, paying his dues in a literal sense. I am serving my purpose, paying my debt to the truth. The truth always leaves a paper trail. And in the end, I was the one holding the final ledger. I am free. Final piece of closure came not through victory in court, but through the bitter, slow drip of reality seeping into Richard's life. I never visited him, but I received periodic updates through my legal team, often forwarded from the prison counsellor. Richard's primary obsession, even years into his sentence, was not regret for his crimes, but the loss of the townhouse and the untouchable millions of my inheritance. He believed I had orchestrated the entire inheritance, a vast trust I never spoke of, just to ensure his financial ruin. He failed to grasp that the truth was much simpler. Aunt Margaret hated him, and her will was designed specifically to protect me from him. Richard's mother, Eleanor, had entirely vanished from his life. She had lost too much, her standing, her pride, and a large chunk of her remaining capital to legal fees and restitution. The few letters Richard sent to her were returned unopened. The man who had based his career on family values and loyalty was now utterly alone, severed from the only remaining person who understood the coded language of his ambition. The crushing reality for Richard was the $8.3 million restitution order. He would spend the rest of his life working low-wage prison jobs, with every penny earned diverted to paying back the veterans and campaign funds he had stolen. The judge ensured that Richard Thorne would never know financial freedom again. His debt was eternal. While Richard served his time in the physical prison he had built for himself, I focused on turning my inherited wealth into a philanthropic weapon against corruption. The Margaret Sterling Foundation for Journalistic Integrity was formally launched. Its mission was precise: fund fearless, long-form investigative journalism that focused specifically on campaign finance, political foundations, and hidden lobbying. My new life wasn't about passive wealth. It was about active redress. I hired a team of dedicated financial analysts and a former IRS auditor. We didn't just write reports. We helped journalists understand complex shell corporations and cross-border money laundering. The foundation didn't just award grants. It provided legal defense for reporters targeted by powerful political figures. The Capitol Ledger became the flagship success story. Within 5 years, Ben and his team, funded by the foundation, exposed 2 more sitting congressmen for similar ethical lapses and outright fraud. The Integrity Initiative became a blueprint for journalistic ethics across the country. The greatest revenge wasn't seeing Richard go to prison. It was seeing the good that came from the money he never got. Every time a veterans organization received a restitution check or a politician was held accountable by a ledger report, I felt a deep, abiding satisfaction. The money was finally doing the work Richard only pretended to do. My personal life, once a spectacle of political ambition, settled into a satisfying rhythm of quiet authenticity. Mark, the history professor, became my anchor. He was the antithesis of Richard, uninterested in DC politics, secure in his own intellectual success, and fiercely protective of my peace. He saw the resilience, not the trauma. He loved the publisher, the reader, the student, not the political prop. After a year of travelling together, exploring ancient ruins, not campaign trails, we decided to marry. The wedding was small, discreet, and entirely on our terms. A quiet ceremony on the shores of Lake Geneva, attended only by Ben, Aisha, and a few close friends. There were no press releases, no political guests, no photos for the front page. When Mark and I exchanged vows, I didn't promise to stand by him in public life or manage his image. I promised to always be honest, to never hide my truth, and to build a life founded on mutual respect and intellectual companionship. Mark knew the full story. He knew about the black box, the scarlet dress, and the inherited millions, and he loved the steel in my spine more than any of my assets. During the reception, Aisha raised a toast. To Clara, who traded a gold-plated cage for a fortress of her own making. To the woman who proved that true love is built on honesty, not applause. 5 years after the wedding, I was back in DC for a foundation gala. I was riding in a taxi from the airport, a discreet black sedan far from the motorcades of my past. The driver was an older, tired-looking man with grey hair and perpetually nervous eyes. He kept checking the rear-view mirror. "Rough traffic, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice vaguely familiar, cracked by stress and time. I looked at him more closely. His jawline, the way his knuckles gripped the wheel, the wariness that aged him beyond his years. It was an impossible, terrible coincidence. "Richard?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of shock or emotion. He flinched violently, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. It was him. Richard Thorne, paroled early due to an overcrowding initiative, working as a rideshare driver to pay off his colossal restitution debt. The former senator, the would-be president, was driving me, the woman he tried to destroy, through the city he once ruled. He didn't plead. He didn't lie. He simply sighed, a sound of profound, weary defeat. "Clara, I heard about your marriage and the foundation. You look well." "I am well, Richard," I replied, my voice steady. "I found my purpose and my peace." We drove in silence for a few blocks. He hadn't asked for money or forgiveness or a second chance. He was simply existing, burdened by the immense ongoing cost of his crime. "The townhouse," he finally muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you keep the old leather chair in the study?" "I sold the townhouse, Richard," I said gently, offering him a final unromantic truth. "And yes, the chair was sold with the house. You have nothing left of that life. You are only responsible for the life you have now." When we reached the hotel, I stepped out, a tall, elegant figure stepping into the bright light of a successful future. He was a shadow, fading into the street. I paid the fare, adding a generous tip, not out of pity, but out of recognition that the payment was a fraction of the restitution he owed. That encounter was the final period on the final sentence of that chapter. I saw Richard Thorne not as a monster, but as a man reduced by his own greed. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was a living example of the cost of a life built on a lie. My life was no longer about looking back. It was about Mark, my work, and the unwavering commitment to the truth. I had been the quiet wife, the overlooked scarlet prop. Richard had assumed that a woman's strength was measured by her visible position next to a powerful man. He never grasped that my true power was in my financial independence, my intellectual rigor, and my willingness to sacrifice the past for the truth. I am Clara Sterling. I am a publisher. I am a wife, and I am finally profoundly free.